Welcome to the Habits and Hustle podcast, a podcast that uncovers the rituals, unspoken habits, and mindsets of extraordinary people. A podcast powered by Habit Nest. Now here's your host, Jennifer Cohen.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm going to do a quick intro. This is Ethan Mollick, right? Is that how you say your name? Perfect. Okay. He wrote the book, The Unicorn Shadow. And you are basically, you're a professor at Wharton Business School, right? Mm-hmm. And you study startups, right? So you are the maven. You know everything about what a startup should do, what it shouldn't do, and everything in between. So welcome to the podcast. We'd love to have you. And
glad to be here. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I guess, why don't we just start with the basics of your background and what kind of makes you the connoisseur, so to speak, on startups? Are you a founder? Were you a startup guy?
Yeah, so I lived through it myself before deciding to become an academic. So I started a company with a college roommate, and we were one of the inventors of the paywall. So the thing that can't get you access to like news, like that's my fault, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that. We were the first people to invent that. And my roommate was amazing. He, had the original idea and was a coder and major investor. And I made every possible mistake there. So we successfully grew the company. We built it. It exited, went through the whole process. But I kind of realized I needed to figure out how to do this right. So I went to get an MBA and then realized nobody really knew anything. And so I decided I'll at least be at the cutting edge of not knowing anything. So I went and got a PhD and became a professor in this. So I teach classes on entrepreneurship. I do active research on entrepreneurship, advise lots of companies. So I want to just be cautious. You were saying I know everything. No one knows everything about this. And I have a very small slice and one perspective out of many.
I was actually just teasing you. I know that. But you've spent a lot of your years really focusing on studying startups and what the pitfalls are, the myths, and your book really talks a lot about the myths of what people think startups are about. You combat the myths. You talk about what holds back startups, about founders, investors, and what I would like to. I have so many questions for you. I'd like to start by just starting. Why don't you tell us also, why did you name the book The Unicorn Shadow? What was the reason for that?
There are two reasons. The first reason is very serious, which is that unicorns are billion-dollar private companies before they go public. So everyone's entrepreneurial goal is to become a unicorn. But the problem is that when trying to be a unicorn, people pick up very bad habits because the models of people who start unicorn companies tend to give you bad ideas about who needs to be a founder. The advice they give is often incorrect, and trying to be a unicorn often leads to trouble. So that's the sort of the shadow of the unicorn. And the other reason is I'm a total nerd, and I thought it sounded like a fantasy novel too. So I kind of wanted to kill two birds with one stone, and start off like a new series. If it doesn't sell well as an entrepreneurship book, I could always call it like number 2, The Wizard's Demise or something, and have a fantasy trilogy out of it. So I wouldn't either way.
Those are two very different reasons,
yeah,
exactly. But can we talk a little bit about some of the most common myths that people have about startups? Why don't you take it and give us a few?
Sure. So I think a lot of them there's a lot of different parts of myths, but the myths start with who founds companies, right? And if you think about famous founders, anyone come to mind when I say like famous founder, like big startup success?
Of course. Mark Zuckerberg would be one.
Yep.
Would be right.
Classic.
And everyone says the same few, I'm sure, right?
Mark Zuckerberg, Musk, Bill Gates, and
Elon Musk, of course.
Exactly. And this model in our head of founders tends to be this 20-something white male college dropout coding geek person tends to be our view in our head. And that influences people, right? So we actually know that, for example, that model discourages people from becoming founders, but that model is like not true in every possible dimension, right? So we could pick any one of those things to talk about why they're not true, right? We can talk about age, right? So you think about this 18-year-old college dropout, 20-year-old college dropout. We actually have really good data now, thanks to work done by Dan Kim, who's a colleague of mine, Pierre Azoulay, and a bunch of other people at MIT, who looked at all the U.S. Census data, right? So this is real definitive, all the data in the U.S. The average age for a founder in the United States is 42. Okay, but you think, okay, maybe that's just for like founders of any company. What about venture capital backed founders? Also 42. Well, okay, maybe what about hypergrowth companies? Companies in the top 0.01% of all growth in the United States, the average age for that is 45 to 59 for founders in that age. So you actually, older founders are much more successful, which makes sense when you think about it, because the vast majority of stuff, having connections, having money, understanding how an industry works, working your way up and being successful and understanding how to run meetings and keep track of things is actually really helpful, right? So we tend to view these sort of young founders as the key. They're not. But we can talk about any of the other dimensions too. Gender in startups is an area I do a lot of research on, about the kinds of companies people found. But almost every one of these myths is wrong. And it's important people know that, because it discourages people from otherwise trying when they could be successful.
That's such a good point. First of all, because you're right. You think about someone, when you first ask me to name someone who's, a very famous founder, I think of someone who has a hoodie on, right? Who basically was at Harvard and dropped out, right? Or something like that, yep. Right? I would never have thought it would have been someone who's in their 40s, right? That's just not where your mind goes to. And that probably stops a lot of people from pursuing whatever their passion or dream is to start something, because they don't think they have a chance.
Yep. Yeah. Right? Exactly. Everyone does pattern matching, right? So what entrepreneurs do is they're very, and venture capitalists, everyone else, is they look for patterns they've seen before and want to jump on those. And our patterns are reinforced by sort of these media views, but not by the actual facts. One of the crazy things about being an academic is we get to study the real data behind this, and it doesn't always match our expectations.
So can you give me some, before I even ask you more about these myths, what did you find about people who, like, for example, if I want to start a company, right? And I say to myself, I can't do, another fitness app. I'm just saying, right? Because it's a saturated market. People stop because they also think a market is flooded with a lot of things already. What kind of data do you show on things that are, kind of saturated? Is there room for, a unicorn or someone to come in still?
Yes, there's a lot of things in what you just said that kind of have to be pulled apart. So one of them is 1/3 of Americans every year have an idea for a startup company, but less than half of them bother even Googling to find out whether the idea exists or not. Almost everyone gives up right away. So saturated markets are hard, right? But almost every market is saturated in some way. So your goal is to find a new customer base, an unmet need, a market that you could use the size of the incumbent company against them to go after them. You don't need an idea that no one's ever had before in the world to be successful, right? This is not the only podcast in the world, but you've carved out a really huge niche and rabid followers, right? And it's not because you were the first to ever come up with the idea of doing a podcast. It's because you found a market need that was out there and were able to go after it and make it work that other people didn't.
So give us some other myths that people fall on, that they stop before they start because they think it's the real deal.
So another one is that you need to be a certain kind of person to be a founder. You need right? This is a really common view. It's sort of the idea that you need something. And here's the interesting thing. We have lots of personality studies. People have been studying entrepreneurship for 40 years, trying to figure out what personality types make you successful as a founder. And here's what we found. There's no clear answer. Nothing actually stands out. Right now, there are some things that help a little bit. There's a couple personality characteristics. Conscientiousness helps you a little bit, but it helps you in almost everything you do, right? So there's almost no kind of myth that nothing that works. Now, there are things that predict you trying to start a company, right? They don't predict success, but they predict trying. So parents who are entrepreneurs is strongly predictive of trying. The biggest personality characteristic that predicts trying is overconfidence. Right? Because you have to, it's like starting a band or becoming an actor. You have to actually ignore the evidence that you're probably going to fail. Right. So overconfidence predicts trying, but doesn't predict success. So you might see a lot of overconfident people. That's not because overconfidence makes you more successful, but overconfident people are more likely to try entrepreneurship. So
that's a good one.
If you think you don't have the personality type because you don't match a Mark Zuckerberg, or you're too caring, or you're not, you like people too much, or you're not vicious enough, or whatever you think the characteristics are, not predictive at all of success, right? So there's no point in sticking with the personality type.
What's another personality type that you can tell me that makes people at least try it? You said overconfidence, parents who were entrepreneurs. Give me a couple other ones.
Yep, there's a bunch of those. So what's called an internal locus of control, which means you like to be in control of your own destiny. So people like that are more likely to start companies, right? Actually, a lot of startups come out of frustration from people in large companies who get annoyed, and then they leave that company taking their best ideas with them and then picking their favorite colleagues to go with them, right? So like that's the other reason why 40-something founders often do really well, is they're able to take advantage of the fact that they can cherry pick the very best people out of a company of already good people and take them with them. So that locus of control is another big issue that predicts entrepreneurial entry. There's also just like, so for example, there's people who just want to be entrepreneurs, and we find it's very consistent. So people who are drug dealers and arrested for dealing drugs as teenagers are much more likely to become entrepreneurs later on than people who are arrested for non-entrepreneurial offenses or felonies, right? So there's a lot of that kind of stuff kind of built in.
I like that. Can we let's talk a little bit about let's say you have an idea. And then can we talk a little bit what makes a really good elevator pitch, and then what makes a really good pitch to get an investor to actually give you money? Yep,
definitely. So we come back to talking about where ideas come from, but let's assume you have a good idea, right? You're ready to launch your company.
Well, let's start with what you just said. Let's go in chronological order where ideas come from. So you want to start with that, and we can kind of move on from there?
Yeah, so there's not like one magical way to generate ideas, but there's 4 or 5 techniques that we know work pretty well, right? And there's some stuff you want to do in advance. So it turns out that there's a few things that are sort of on the habits side of habits and hustle that everybody should do that are very clearly make you more creative and more successful, right? And the clearest one of these is sleep. So it turns out sleep is just overwhelmingly important for creativity. And I say this as someone who sleeps like 5 hours a night, unfortunately, but it turns out like if you sleep, like people who don't sleep generate worse ideas, but they also aren't as good at evaluating those ideas. So people who don't sleep, who have insomnia, are more likely to start companies, but they're more likely to start companies around bad ideas. People who sleep more actually are less likely to start companies with better ideas, right? So it actually there's some evidence like people who with ADHD are more likely to launch companies and in the same way, insomnia has some of those same characteristics, right? Once you've started a company, also, by the way, sleep matters a lot. So sleep sets your mood. And if you're in a good mood, your company catches your good mood and makes the entire company more innovative. If you don't sleep, we actually have evidence that takes your bad mood with you. And also, by the way, sleep also lets you solve problems you didn't think you had. So people who try and solve puzzles and then sleep on it are actually more creative the next day when they think of things. So mindfulness is helpful, but only about half as good as sleep in terms of restoring, spending the same amount of time sleeping in terms of restoring that creativity.
So sleep is the number one to generate.
It's a nice thing to have in the baseline, right? Other things that increase creativity, caffeine increases creativity. So far and away, caffeine basically does everything good. So increases working memory, fluid intelligence, and your ability to and creativity. Also, alcohol actually does increase creativity. We know that up to a point, although a culture of alcohol in startup companies is destructive. So just watch your drinking. So that's sort of baseline stuff, right? Also on the baseline side of good ideas, be curious and be learning about the world. So for example, people have better ideas if they're on Twitter and they are connected to lots of disconnected other people on Twitter. So they're learning ideas from all kinds of places. People who read a lot of information from different sources. So that's all baseline. Okay, so once we have that, how do we come up with a good idea? Okay, a few techniques, all right? Technique number 1 is sort of scratching your own itch. So find a problem that you have. This is another reason why somebody who's already in a company might do quite well. I often tell people the hint is if you're in a company and you see Excel being used for anything else, the Word program, the Office program being used for anything other than spreadsheets, that's a sign of a need, because Excel is the programming language available to most people in most offices, and people improvise all sorts of stuff in Excel. So if you see people using Excel for something wrong, you can build a product instead of that Excel thing and often make money. But whatever problems that you've had, you know those problems really well. That's a really great place to start. A second set of approaches is what's called effectual approaches. Okay, so effectual comes from this work by Sarah Sarasvathy, who's a professor at the University of Virginia, who studied successful entrepreneurs and found out a lot of them took the typical way people do marketing, which she called causal, and flipped it on its head, which is why she calls it effectual. So what does that mean? That means you start off with some principles. You start with the principle of who am I? What do I know? Right? And who do I know? So you start off with the resources you have at hand and think, what company can I build with that? So what are my special skills that I have? What do I know that other people don't? Who do I know that other people don't? What connections do I have? And often people have some weird hobby or other interest that they could potentially turn into a startup company of some sort, right?
Right.
So that's the kind of basis that you build from, is thinking about what you know, who you know. That's another useful way to think about ideas. I've talked a lot. What other...
No, I was going to say, a lot of times, you hear the expression a lot, like 1% is, what is it? Your idea is 1% and the execution is 99%. So really, how good is an idea if you don't know how to execute properly? So that's really where, is that then finding a team around you that kind of supports the things that you're not good at to help you get this idea into an actual to fruition?
Yeah, so if you have a good idea, you'll need people to do that, right? And there's two ways to get people. There's having other founders with you, co-founders and a co-founding team. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that co-founders are something people think are absolutely necessary for startups, but it turns out that, at least based on some data and the research I've been doing with Jason Greenberg at NYU, is that co-founders are actually not always necessary. In fact, solo founders often do better, because their co-founders and them often get into arguments, right? And then the personal stuff can be really hard. You could also hire people to do that job, right? You can get employees that could do jobs for you. And we talk about, one of the things we talk about in the book is the method that you use to hire people is also something that there's been a lot of scientific research on recently.
Because you're right. I think also people end up getting a co-founder because they feel that they sometimes don't feel the confidence in themselves solely to do something, that they want a partner in crime. They feel like they'll be more successful just based on having someone that they're in it with, versus, like you were saying, a lot of times it's probably much better to hire out those people and even own more of the company, a lot of the times.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and so it depends on how much money you have, and it goes back to your topic of fundraising. But, I think what I would say is, if you've got a co-founder, also our data shows something interesting, which is the best co-founders and again, one paper, so please take everything with a grain of salt, right, on this one. But it turns out family was actually the best to found with, and most people don't think. And then the second best, and the data is pretty strong on this, co-workers, people you've worked with before. It could be people you've worked with at school, people you've worked with outside of school, but people you've worked with before, you're going to have less conflicts with because you know how to work with them already.
Wow, so that's so funny, because people always, again, these are big myths, right? Because you think that you always hear never work with family. And you're saying family is the number one person that you would be the most successful with, according to the data. I understand. I know, according to data.
And I don't know how that affects your family when you fail, right? Because, I can't tell you whether it's good personally for you. But if you think about most of the biggest companies in the world, a lot of them, they all start as family-run companies, right? Almost all the biggest private companies in the world are still family-run companies. So we sort of say there's all these giant family-run companies, right? But who cares about that? But it's telling us something, right?
Absolutely. And then I guess that's interesting, because when you first start a company, let's talk a little bit about when you are looking for people to invest, and we'll go through the other ways, pitching, everything. People go to family. There's family, angel, accelerators, crowdfunding. When do you use what? When do you go to an accelerator? When do you use an angel investor? I would imagine family, you obviously go to first, right? That's like seed money.
So it depends on your friends and family, right? So if we look at the actual stats, the number one source of funds for high growth startups in the US, based on a representative survey, is your own personal savings, right? Another reason why somebody who's, your personal money. Second is debt. Right. And then on average, the third is all those other forms, what we call diluted funding, angels and venture capitalists who take a piece of your company in return for giving you money. That's why they're dangerous to take money from, because they're going to own a piece of your company, and they're often very good at using that to their advantage and not to yours. And then the fourth biggest source of funding is friends and family. And if you can get friends and family money, that's great, right? But the one downside is, it's often incredibly stressful to take friends and family money, because you believe in yourself, great, they believe in you, But then now you've got your whole family's cash is on the line, not just your own. And we know that stress causes all sorts of things, including not just stressing out personally, but it actually makes you less likely to take risks because you're worried about risking your friends and family money. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Lots of people do. It's valuable. But you need to make sure that you're not just kind of pulling on obligations, and you think about how to make that work.
So how about it? Okay, so when do you go to an angel versus an accelerator?
Okay, so investors will only invest in you, these outside investors, angels, accelerators, and I don't know if your audience knows these different groups, and I'm happy to explain them otherwise.
I think that what we should do is, I would imagine some do, but some won't. So let's just pretend that let's start with the baseline and then move on from there. Okay,
so we just talked about friends and family, your own money, and debt, right? Your own money and friends and debt are what we call non-diluted funding, right? No one's taking a piece of your company. You might also be able to get grant money. That's a great way to go if you can get government grant money, because that doesn't take a piece of your company. Usually friends and family, you're diluting your company down, but sort of on friendly terms. All the rest of the stuff we're talking about is what we call dilutive funding. Why is someone investing in you? Because they want a piece of your company. So when your company sells for a lot of money, they get a piece of the return. They're making an investment in you, right? So you can only usually raise most of these kinds of funds if you're planning on going big, right? Most business in America is not. If you're trying to launch a restaurant, it's very hard for you to get angel money or venture capital money or accelerator money unless you're going to launch a whole chain of restaurants, because you might make a lot of money running a restaurant. It's a very good business, right? Or a catering business or a dry cleaner, or whatever you want. Those are very good businesses. You can get very wealthy doing it. But I
thought restaurants are terrible businesses because they.
Yeah, I mean, but it could be successful for you, right?
Okay.
Or if you want to open a retail store or you want to open a gym, right? All of those things are viable ways to make quite a bit of money for yourself. They're all dangerous. They have their own risks, right? Not getting into huge detail on which ones, but none of those will get you venture capital or angel investment money generally, because what you're hoping to do is take home your profits, right? You're going to make maybe you make a couple $1 million a year, you pay 100 and, you pay 1.2 million in expenses, you take home 800,000 and you're a very happy person, but you're going to run that for the rest of your life, right? And that's not something that you're going to exit or sell to very easily, right? Similarly, even like doctor's offices, right? It's a great business to run, or a chiropractor, or whatever you're doing, good bit, or law office, right? Those are not the kinds of things that get angel money generally, or venture capital money. So you get angel or venture capital money when you're launching an app, a B2B business, you're trying to go a chain of gyms, right? You're trying to go big.
Right. And my question was more, at what point do you go try to get the VC money? What point? Because, at what level, right? You go from friends and family. Do you do crowdfunding? Can we talk about the crowdfund? When do you do what? So let's break it down for people,
right?
Because there's so many different ways to skin this cat, and I think it's really important to kind of really explain when is, in your data, your knowledge, when do you do what?
Okay, so the way to think about this is that there's rounds of funding, is what it's referred to in sort of Silicon Valley, right? So you have a friends and family round is usually first, where you're getting money from friends and family. Then there's what's called a seed round usually, then an A round, a B round, a C round, and each round goes up in size. So in the Silicon Valley world, a seed round is usually under $1 million of capital raised. A round is 1.5 billion, and you have like 3 million for a B round, and it goes up from there. It depends on a lot of circumstances. So usually you'll go to an accelerator or crowdfunding before you raise an A round. So usually you'll get money from friends and family, you use that money, and yourself, you'll use that money to prove that your idea works, get some really good initial data, or prepare for a crowdfunding launch, like Kickstarter. Or you'll go to angel investors at that point and try and raise a few $100,000 based on that initial money. You'll use that round then to show that you can actually scale your business, and then you go to venture capitalists. And the venture capitalists usually have to invest $1 million plus to make it worth their while to talk to you. So you need to show that your company is worth several $1 million to make that happen.
Good, thank you. So thank you for just clarifying all of that. Now let's talk about making an elevator pitch versus a pitch. How do you make a really strong elevator pitch? A lot of times people don't know how they don't know how to make that sound bite successful, and they're like and
yeah. So the book has a little more on this, because I'll give you a formula, but it might be a little. It's pretty quick, right? So the first thing is to realize your goal of an elevator pitch is to get someone to ask you questions, right? An elevator pitch will not answer everyone's questions, and the best founders actually leave room for questions. They purposefully leave out something so they control the dialogue. So when they say something, it's the first question someone asks is, yes, but have you thought about this? And you're like, yes, I have. I'm glad we're talking about this. And now we're in a conversation. So the elevator pitch doesn't answer all the questions, right? It just shows you the basics. And there's a formula for it. So the formula start off is and I'm going to sound like Mad Libs here. For a blank who blanks, the blank is a blank that blanks. Unlike blank, we blank. So it's for your customer who has a need. Our product name is a product category that offers some benefit. Unlike our competitors, we're different in a key way. So your goal is to fill in the blank. So let's say we're doing the Tesla pitch, right? For high-end, like let's imagine we're doing the original Tesla Roadster, right? For high-end car fans, right? That's our audience who want who want a sports car that's environmentally friendly. The Tesla Roadster is a high-end electric car that offers the following benefit. It is very fast without any carbon emissions. Unlike Ferraris or Porsches, our competitors, we offer high performance without damaging the environment. So in those two sentences, I imagine tell you what our product is, what category it's in, who's going to buy it, why they're going to buy it, how we'll beat the competition. So that's a place to start.
And so there's an actual formula that people can just follow to really get their elevator pitch succinct like that.
The basics. Right now, if you just say that, it sounds pretty boring. So you'll come up with all sorts of other stuff. You'll come with a cool hook, right? Like, did you know? I could have, if I was Musk, I could have said like, hey, did you know that the $8 billion a year supercar market has no equivalent to the Prius? Now that's a really good hook because you probably didn't know it was an $8 billion a year market. So now you go from like, how many supercars are out there to, oh, that's actually a big market. And you start to think, wait, why isn't there equivalent of a Prius in this high-end market? So that's a hook. It gets you in and interested. I could talk about the team, right? I'm a successful founder myself, right? I could ask you for something. So there's variations, but that's a good place to start.
And then how about another, like an actual pitch when you are sitting in front of investors? How do you create a really solid pitch and all the data that you've So there's a formula again. And I've got a YouTube video that goes through it if you want to do that. The book goes through it. So there's right now, as of today, there's 10 to 12 slides. And you do those 10 to 12 slides in a very precise way. And when I launched my startup company in the late 90s, early 2000s, instead you sent people a 200-page business plan. That was your starting pitch. Now you don't do that. Now you send people a 10-slide deck. 10 years of the future, it might be a virtual reality experience or a singing telegram. I have no idea. But right now, it's a slide deck. And there's a clear formula in that also. Now, the step we're skipping is actually getting access to these investors is not easy. You actually need what's called a warm introduction. So you need someone who the investor trusts to make an introduction. Your chance of success is 13 times greater if you have a warm introduction than a cold one. So your first quest is actually to meet these venture capitalists. And one of the things I outline in the book, and I'm happy to talk about, is some of the research on how you meet venture capitalists if you don't already know who they are. Yeah, let's talk about it. I think that's a really good thing to talk about.
Sure, and I'm sorry for all the data dumps, by the way. So happy to talk about anything else here.
No, I actually enjoy the data dumps because you can learn a lot from this stuff because this is what you do, right? You research and you see so much data, and why I wanted to have you on is that we can glean a lot of information from this data that most layman people don't know, right? So we're going off these generalities that we see around, but like you said, like I didn't know until you were on here that the actual average age of an entrepreneur was 42. I really did think it was someone who were in their late 20s, for example, right? So you learn a lot from this stuff.
And then, by the way, you have lots of really impressive people on this podcast. I think I always have a balancing knowledge and wisdom, right? So like the wisdom they have is valuable, right? But it may or may not apply to you. So it's worth knowing the cold hard facts.
100. I could not
everywhere. Yeah.
100%. Like that's exactly it. Like it's one thing to hear from someone who's sold their company for $1 billion, but it's another thing to really know the real meat on the bone of how it's actually done.
So let me tell you the secret to, so there's actually the best way to raise venture capital. All right. This is going to shock you, is to have already raised venture capital. So if you've already been successful, people will keep throwing money at you. I know this is a shocker.
Yeah. But so true, though.
Yeah, and it actually is. It turns out, there's a lot of research trying to figure out what the value of being a serial entrepreneur is, right? So starting companies multiple times. And the latest data we have is kind of suspicious because it seems to show that almost all the value of being a serial entrepreneur comes from knowing venture capitalists and that they'll fund you. And if you take away that element, they're not that much better than first-time founders.
Wow. So the only real benefit is that they actually know a person that can actually give you the money, a VC person.
So that's some of the data suggesting that. So I don't say there's nothing, but it's less strong. Like you think it's because it's so wise.
It's less strong. Yeah, it's not as strong as it's not as strong as you would think, right? Because a lot of times, how about if you're a serial entrepreneur that actually hasn't had that much success? I mean, they've had like moderate success, but not anything that, I mean, was there anything to that? They'll keep on getting money also just because they've done it so many times. They know the right people.
Before, right. If they've raised cash before and they tell a good story. In fact, one of the reasons why it's really hard to learn from other people's failures in entrepreneurship is that we actually have really good ethnographic studies that show that the stories people tell about why they failed have nothing to do with why they actually failed, right? It's all about telling a story that you're still the hero, wasn't your fault, no one, So you always hear like, oh, we just timed the market wrong. They'll never be like, I yelled at everyone in the office and everyone hated me. And then I blew all the money on a bad decision. But let's return to the steps to getting entrepreneurship. Okay, getting venture capital money. So this is a paper by Kathy Eisenhart, and I'm trying to remember who the second person is in the book. I apologize if my colleagues are listening. I'm not trying to not credit you. But they found, it's in the book. Look at 150 footnotes, 80 pages, but still fun.
I love that it's also so little. Like you can get through this. It's a handbook.
Yeah, it's right. It's tiny, right? Tiny, short. Yeah. There's a couple jokes, not too bad. Mostly dad jokes. I apologize in advance. So it's a 4-step process. All right. So step 1 is called casual dating, and this is actually what's called in the method. So in casual dating, your goal is to create connections with venture capitalists before you need their money. Right? You need those warm introductions. Once you start asking for money, it's a trouble. So you need to build out your network first. So how do you build out your network? Venture capitalists spend a huge amount of their time meeting people. So if you can get into that network and get introductions and meet people, people are happy to meet you for 20 minutes for lunch or breakfast. It's usually breakfast meetings in venture capital. And you want to meet as many of them as possible. And you want to have conversations that are neither about asking for money, nor are they entirely like, how's your kids, how's life, right? They need to be focused, but not entirely about business. So the thing you usually want to do is ask for advice. They love giving advice. So, and you want to ask for advice though about things that are actually that make you look good, right? So you want advice like, how do I apply for a patent? They're like, that person's incompetent. Instead, you want to say like, I have these 2 amazing customers. Which one should I go for, right? Like you want to give that kind of advice. So you're gonna have a lot of casual. It
elevates you to make you look like you're sought after, but not like that you're a moron that you don't know how to fill out some kind of application of some kind.
Right, and you're giving them stakes in your decisions, right? So casual.
There's a fine line.
Yeah, exactly. So like you have to kind of do this in advance, right? And you need this well in advance of raising money. By the way, it's 83 days on average between contacting a VC and raising money if you do. So it's a long process already. You need to start this months in advance of that.
Wow. 83 days between meeting the VC and then actually being able to ask them for money.
And closing the deal. Closing the deal. That's assuming they have the first, that means you're starting the process. So you need to start this even more in advance. I mean, think about 6 months or so before you want to raise cash. You're doing casual dating. Okay? Second thing you need to do. Here's a big secret of venture capitals. Like nobody knows who's going to win in the early stages of companies. We can't actually predict who's going to win very well once you pass the quality threshold, right? So we can rule out like bad players pretty easily. But once it's like, oh, that's a good idea and you seem qualified, it's hard to know who's going to win, right? So you need to show signals to the venture capitalists that you're going to be one of the winners. And how you do that is by what's called proof point timing. You want to show a lot of evidence you're going to win all right before you need the money. So that means that you're trying to get like a flow of good news that you can tell your casual dates about. You're just basically humble bragging to them, right? Like, so what you want to do is like, hey, you want to email them, a customer just agreed to buy our product. Oh, we won this grant. Oh, we just went to start a pitch contest and won. Oh, we just hired this famous person. All the good news has to happen like a drumbeat, one after another, right before you raise money. So when the venture capitalists get emails about this, because you now can contact them because they're casual dates, they're like, wow, this company's hot. Right, so you want to give the appearance of hotness, and that usually means speed up good news, but it could also be slowing down news that might hit at the wrong time, so it all hits at the right moment.
Oh my gosh, it's very methodical, actually. You have to be methodical about this process.
Well, and that's, I think, the big failure people make with startups. Startups need to be biased towards action. They need to be doing stuff, but they shouldn't be doing random stuff. They need to be doing the right things at the right times. Right? It's not just like, I'm going to go out and make things happen. You might succeed, you might not. And of course, the model people follow with things like Facebook, right, where it's like, oh, they just did stuff and stuff happened. If you're lucky enough to be at the right time, at the right place, Mark Zuckerberg did not invent social networks, right? The one really super clever idea he had was launching at colleges first, but it wasn't even clear it was clever as much as luck. They lucked into that because he was at college. But like once Facebook was on the exponential curve, you couldn't stop it. It wasn't like it was brilliant leadership and marketing. It was, wow, this is the thing everybody wants. So
is it more momentum?
Yeah, exactly. Momentum. Right, momentum and good timing at the right time. It's not like it's not smart, right?
Right.
And we argue about whether Zuckerberg's grown into an amazing CEO or not, right? And there's arguments both ways, but he certainly wasn't an amazing CEO as an 18-year-old, right, or 20-year-old or whatever. He was running a hot company, and it would be hard to derail that. So that's not the model you want to follow. That's not the unicorn model. You want to follow a methodical model to become a unicorn, not follow their model. So, all right, so that was step 2. Let me give you the last couple of steps real quickly. The third step is you actually need to know why your funders want to invest in you. So they want something too, right? Do they want to invest in you because they've had a lot of big hits and they think you're the next one? Do they want to invest in you because their investment fund is winding up and they need a big hit and they missed one? Do they want to invest in you because they're interested in the space? But you have to understand that. And then finally, you're going to structure competition so that there's lots of options and so people are bidding for you. In a useful way. I talk about that more in the book. So if you do those 4 steps, you can get a similar outcome to knowing VCs, but it takes a lot more work.
Talk about the last one, about a lot more options and that they're bidding for you. How do you expand on that?
Okay, so you need to figure out a way so that you have alternate paths to getting resources if you can't get VC. So maybe you're going to run a crowdfunding campaign. Maybe you have a way of keeping growing with your current revenue, even though it won't be as fast. So that way, if the VC does it, you don't have to be begging for them. You don't have to you can sort of back off if it's not going well without burning all your contacts. Second thing you want to do is structure competition. So you want to start with your least desirable partners. As soon as somebody says yes, then everybody jumps in and says yes. So you need to start with the person who wants you. You've already scrutinized their interest. You want to start with the person who needs you most, even if you don't like them, because that can start the ball rolling and start the process.
How much, so I just asked you a little bit about this, but how much of this in your data is about momentum and luck? How much of it is all these strategies and methodologies, and how much is it just simple luck and momentum?
So momentum comes from strategies and luck. So momentum is what happens afterwards. Luck is huge, right? But skill is also big. So whether I told you it's 30% luck or 70% luck, it's still going to be either 70% skill or 30% skill. Skill still matters, right?
The skill does matter.
Timing matters. It's so complicated. The reason we can't predict success, even knowing all of this stuff, is it's complicated, right? It's a big mess. Like there's so much stuff that has to go right, and you have to have lucky breaks, but you have to also take advantage of lucky breaks. You have to make your own luck. Resilient entrepreneurs who bounce back from failure do better. Almost all entrepreneurs who are successful do some pivoting or changing of direction as they go. So you're almost certainly going to fail a bit. So taking that failure, turning it into success by pivoting, all of that has to come into play.
How much is branding and just marketing, just being smart on how you're branding yourself?
So I think you need to know your talent, right? If you are really good at branding, I've looked a little bit into some of your work too. Like this is something you're obviously very good at doing. Then your special skill or talent, going all the way back to that effectuation idea, really matters. What are you good at that no one else in the world is good at? But if you're not good at branding, if you're not good at marketing, then marketing often comes later for startup companies. You usually only want to market as a startup company once you have what we call product market fit. Once you know why people are buying your product, because then you market to why they're buying rather than based on guesses about why they buy. Now, there are magical marketers out there who could start with like a brand and then build things around it. But often even the magical brands start with the idea of like, what's the need? How do I know the need is there? And then how do I build from that?
And then, so let's get back with the investing, right? So how do we actually get the investor to give us the money? Like you talked a little bit about in the book, something called Symbol of Success.
Yeah. So it's one of these things that sounds like it's like fictional, right? It sounds like it's like a visualization technique, but it's not. And I'll explain why. So it's called symbolic action. Entrepreneurs who look
okay, this is
symbols of success, same thing, right? The entrepreneurs who look like they're going to succeed are more successful. And the reason goes back to what I was telling you before, right? We don't know who's going to succeed. So we're looking for signals, right? We're looking for things that might indicate success. We're looking for patterns that match other founders. So if you look like you're going to be successful, right, which can mean many things, we'll talk about that, then investors and stuff will say, yeah, that person seems like they know what they're doing, right? And by the way, you are kind of showing you know what you're doing because you're doing enough to kind of put together the story of a founder, right? So there's a bunch of categories here. And I often like to use the example, I think I do in the book at some point, of Theranos. So did you ever watch like Bad Blood or read Bad Blood or watch either the Theranos documentaries? About Elizabeth Holmes?
No, but tell me. I know, but I never read that. But tell us anyway. I'm sure lots of other people have.
It was like a Netflix documentary and an HBO documentary, and it's about this amazing con woman, Elizabeth Holmes, who wears like a black turtleneck and speaks with a gravelly voice. And
I should go watch it. I'm going to start watching it.
Yeah, it's really amazing, right? She raised like $1 billion of venture capital, and the product it was a blood test.
Oh my gosh.
Right.
Of course. This was a while ago. This was a few years ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, the documentary just came out like this spring or this fall or something like that. But yeah,
this story happened a few years ago.
Exactly.
I do remember this actually. Yes.
Especially like how this woman raised $1 billion with a non-working product and have hundreds of employees, and how did this not happen, right? And part of how she did is she did this symbolic manipulation stuff, right? It starts with personal. So Stanford dropout, right? Must be good at what they're doing, right? Wears a black turtleneck like Steve Jobs. In fact, all the articles referred to as like modeled after Steve Jobs. Well, like, what does that have to do at all with success? Like, but that's fine, right?
Absolutely.
Would wear a lab coat over that, even though she didn't, compelling personal story that was somewhat fictionalized about her uncle with cancer. All of that showed I'm the person who's like, I look like a founder who's going to be successful, right? And then there's like, winning awards, showing prototypes. That was important. Having an important board of directors. She had this amazing board of directors, including people like Jim Mattis, who was the Secretary of Defense, right? Henry Kissinger was on her board of directors. Like, notice all of those people, though, very important people. Not a single one of them knew anything about biotech, right?
Not one.
It was a fancy name list, and if you can have fancy names, you must be successful. She had like a fancy office, right, with like all these equipment that look like the kind of things that all of this stuff was symbols of success, and it becomes self-fulfilling, right? Because you're like, well, these people thought she was good, and she's dressed like this, and she acts like this. That might be successful.
It's true. I mean, just on that same vein, people I look at a lot, I see all the time, actually, who I feel like, what did they ever do? But they come from the right pedigree, right? They know a lot of very, very wealthy people who are very successful. So through just association, people would assume that they are, and they're able to do all sorts of things that other people are not because they are extraordinarily talented or skilled or smarter. It's just because of their ability to kind of, there's either the social circle or their ability to kind of con somebody to believe that they are by just perception, like by their visual, I find that to be so interesting because it's a psychological thing. You think people would kind of know better by now, but it doesn't seem to, to work all the time.
Right. I mean, it works positively and negatively, right? Like, so it's really, there's some interesting sets of trade-offs that kind of happen depending on how you present yourself, right? It's not always presenting yourself as super slick. It could be that, you like being the science nerd is also could be helpful, right? It's about showing people what they want to see, what they expect to see, because they don't have other evidence, right? What we're looking for is symbols that you know what you're doing, not because it's like, we're programming you with those symbols or it's like, but it's, I don't know if you're going to succeed or not. How do I know? Before I listen to your podcast, how do I know it's going to be good, right? So I look at there's a number of stars. I look at I go to the website. You've got a very nice professional website that makes it look like you know what you're doing on this. And there's a great
I tricked you.
And it's great. I'm really happy to be on it. But it is about like first impressions and second impressions matter. And good founders take advantage of those. It doesn't substitute for substance, by the way, right? It's not the same thing. And as you get more, as the company moves on, you go from like all of this sort of soft stuff to like, show me how much revenue you have, right? Like everything else we're saying is trumped by like, I'm making a lot of money, right? That will get you open a lot more doors than anything else. Right. But we're talking about that early stage when you're still trying to kind of get that sense, then the symbols matter more.
What other things are ways that or are things that the investors look at to actually to pass over the money? What else?
So another thing is there's a difference between professional and amateur investors, venture capitalists and frequent angel investors. I think Shark Tank being professionals, right? And most other angel investors might be amateurs. Professional investors, interestingly, are not swayed at all by the passion of your pitch, right? Like you can be really good at pitching and use all kinds of, like be really charismatic, does not move the needle. They're looking at they only care about how prepared the pitch is, how well the pieces fit together, how logical it is, because they've seen 1,000 of these, right? So like you, you could be really passionate and really like convincing, and they'll see through the symbols better. While an amateur investor is much more swayed by passion.
Like, is that like so that would be more like a Shark Tank, right? Like what would make a Shark Tank pitch really hit that gets all 4 sharks to invest? What would be the things? Symbols of success?
Yeah. So it's interesting. We actually have Shark Tank data that actually shows really good demos is what makes Shark Tank succeed.
Really?
Because the demo shows, it does all the symbol stuff. It shows that the product actually works, right? It shows you know how to sell it. And it lets people visualize what the future looks like with your product in it.
Right.
So that stuff all seems to play a role. I mean, now I will be clear, like one of the negative things is like, there's downsides of this too, right? So like female entrepreneurs make up 38% of all business in the US are started by women. But do you know what, I maybe remember the book, but what percentage of VC-backed companies have female founders?
Isn't it it's a low number, isn't it?
5 to 8%.
Yeah, I was going to say it must be. I was like lower than like 5%.
Yeah, it's insane, right? Especially because we actually have really strong evidence that women are at least as good at running companies as men, right? The data is scattered between no difference and a positive difference at this point. One's conditional on getting funding, right? And not only that, women find areas of businesses and other underrepresented groups do as well that wouldn't be available to like a white male starting a company, right? Because you start with your own interested background. When women, for example, female inventors tend to create patents in areas that are less clear, that there are less patents in, and they tend to be more focused on problems that women have. Right? Because those are under so there's a lot of reason why men should invest in women, right? Female-led startups. Right. Part of the reason they don't is because of some of these biases in perception. So there's a really cool study by Dana Kans and Laura Huang and others that shows that female investors get asked different questions. Female entrepreneurs get asked different questions than men. So women get asked about how they're going to avoid losing, and men get asked how they're going to win. And women get more penalized for using risk language, talking about how they're going to take a risk. So the stereotypes run both ways in these cases. Yeah.
I have one that I want to know if it's a myth or not, that people tend to want to do business also with people that they feel that they are similar to, that look like them, that they feel that there's like a similarity between them. Is that true or false?
100% true. We call that principle homophily. Basically, we like people like us. It's actually like Aristotle came up with the original, like birds of the feather flock together. Basic human principle. We like people like ourselves, right? This leads to all kinds of trouble if you're trying to be innovative, because diversity brings innovation, but we end up being comfortable with people like us. Now, there are some advantages, right? We know like South Asian American, like Indian American entrepreneurs invest in more Indian American companies. Chinese American entrepreneurs invest in more Chinese American run companies. Part of that's homophily. We like people like us, but part of it's also networks, right? If I'm checking up on you and want to make sure you're actually good and we're from the same community, I could check into that. So it becomes reinforcing in a lot of ways. But this becomes a problem in receiving in venture capitalists, right? Because VCs tend to be vast majority of white males, often from like 5 schools, right? So it's like Stanford, Harvard, Penn, a couple other places. And their networks consist of people like them. So when I talk to even very enlightened male VCs, and they're like, why are you not investing in more female companies? They'll often say, I don't see any female entrepreneurs. They're just not coming to me. And that's because their network is also all of men, and their network is men. And so it's really hard for women to even break into this network in a warm introduction way, not because this person's personally biased, but because their network is biased.
Right.
So really good founders or really good investors are realizing, like, I need to invest in more Black founders. I need to invest in more female founders because that's how I'm going to grow my portfolio. Right. But I can't use the same tools of assessing, do I like this person? It's just a terrible principle in general. It's bad for hiring, it's bad for innovation, and it's bad for investing.
So you just said something that was interesting. You're like, you keep on naming schools. Like you said, you keep on saying Stanford, Harvard. I don't think I've heard you say Wharton yet.
Penn. Wharton's the business school of Penn.
Okay, but fine. But still, like, aren't you specifically aren't you a professor in the business school of Wharton, or no?
Yeah, I might want to brag too much. I mean, I'm happy to do it. But yeah, so okay, here's
you should brag.
Okay, here's the brag bit combined with a problem. Okay, so I'm going to give you both things so I don't feel too bad about bragging. All right.
Okay.
So just to show you how uneven the venture capital game is, last year, everybody in the nations of France and Germany put together raised $5.8 billion of venture capital. Penn grads, Wharton grads, raised $8.7 billion in venture capital. So more than everybody in the two of the three most advanced economies in Europe put together. Now, I'd like to say that's all because of my teaching, because I teach them, and it's great. People have raised like $1 billion of VC out of my class. It's wonderful, but it's not that, right? It's about these networks and these connections help in these cases.
Absolutely, but I actually have here written down to even ask you about that, because what I find very interesting is that I was going to say to you, it's right here. It says, why do you think that there are so many Wharton Penn, I put Wharton/Penn students that when they leave, they do so well in the real world? Like that, I think it's exponentially better than other places, even other business schools. There is even I saw that data. Yeah. And I know for myself, my first cousin went there, and he's extraordinarily successful, and every one of his friends are extraordinarily successful in lots of areas, right? What is the reason? Besides you, of course, being their professor. Yeah. Besides that, that's obvious. Okay, let's not state the obvious. What are the other reasons?
All right. So reason one is we get to pick the best people in the world, right? So everybody applies. We get whatever it is, 10%, 15% acceptance rate. We get to cherry pick, right?
Second, doesn't Harvard also, and Princeton and Yale, and
so that's very true, right? So other places do it. We're neck and neck with these people, right? It varies one way or another, right? I also think that we do a good job of evidence-based teaching. I think our teaching is really good, and then we've got great networks. We're a bigger business school than some. Of the top business schools, we're one of the larger ones, and so we have a pretty big connection network. More CEOs. It becomes self-fulfilling. So the highest percentage of CEOs of tech companies come from Penn. So the CEO of Google is a Wharton grad, right?
Right.
And so we have a lot. Elon Musk is from Penn, went to Penn. So we have a lot of top people, but there's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. You get the network connections. We get people hired from there, so you get a good first job. I did some research on looking at people who went to high prestige companies instead of lower prestige companies that paid more. And they get less pay early on, but they make a lot more money later on in life because they went to high prestige. So you're kind of paying for the prestige early on. So, I mean, there's a bit of talent, there's a bit of luck, and there's a bit of prestige that gets transferred to you from being at a top school.
Now, for you guys to take, for Wharton to take students, this is a discussion I have with people, my friends, a lot. Does it matter what high school that the kids go to as a feeder school to get into Wharton, or is it easier to get into Wharton if you're at a public school where you can be a superstar, right, getting like A+++, or going to a private high school where it's super competitive amongst the children and they grade where it's harder to get like an A+, let's say, than it would be at a public school?
So I'm not in the admissions committee, and I'm not even allowed to talk to them under most circumstances.
Under any circumstance.
So yeah, I don't know why they've hidden themselves from me. But I think I only get to do so much. I grew up in Wisconsin, right, and had never even been midday East Coast schools till I went to college. So I totally get that. I think that when I hire RAs, right, so when I get to see the resumes of my undergrad students, I would just say they're all extremely talented, right? And I think that one of the things to think about is the school's taking advantage of your background, the adversity that you faced, but being entrepreneurial about not just making money, but being entrepreneurial about finding opportunities to show off how great you are, how you can make a difference, how you create new things. or make a really big difference in this. So I think it's really thinking about that. And I'd encourage people to do, to show they're clearly passionate in something and actually be passionate in something rather than just trying to check every box.
Right. No. So are you saying then that I understand, so having extracurricular things that show that you are, you have other hobbies and you're good at other things. I understand that. Now, just on that one question about private school versus public school, just from what you've seen, does it make a difference what your feeder is? If it's do you see more people getting in that were from private schools that were like a feeder, or is it just the same equal value going to a public school?
So I could tell you, I went to public school and I'm sending my kids to public school. So I can't give you an exact estimate.
You are sending your kids to public school.
My kids to public school. So it's hard to know, right? Like it's definitely the case that I was an undergrad at Harvard, 20 years ago or whatever. And there were less people from Wisconsin, where I grew up for all 4 years at Harvard, than there were 1 year from Phillips Exeter Academy, which is like a fancy private school.
Yeah.
So they also seem to do okay. So it's hard for me to know, as somebody who has been away from the admissions process and didn't come in through that elite world.
Right.
I can't tell you, unfortunately I can't give you the hints on this. I'd like to know the secrets myself, actually, for my own kids about how to break into these schools.
Yeah. So I'm telling you,
I look at the students who are like the kids I'm teaching now, and I'm like, oh my God, they're so qualified. I would never get to college today. So
that was my next question. The people that you're teaching alone, are they mostly kids who went to a private school or people who went to a public school?
About a quarter international, or 20% are international. From all over the world, and then the others, it's really a mix. I mean, I see a lot of public schools, a lot of private schools. I don't know what the ratio is. Sorry,
You're a data person.
Yeah, except I don't have the admissions data, right? The one thing they won't.
I know.
So
can you steal it from them and kind of get back to me on the DL later on?
I the DL, yeah, exactly.
Okay, that's fine. I'm gonna hold you to that. Okay. Another question I wanted to ask you is, what's the most surprising thing you have found in your research that really shocked you? What are a couple of things that you were like, wow, I would never have thought this to be the case?
So a few things I think are important. One of the things that I found that was really surprising is, so I told you how women are disadvantaged in a lot of cases in raising money. The one place that women outperform men is in crowdfunding. So a female-run project compared to a male-run project is 13% more likely to succeed, right? And why is that the case? I delved into this problem with Jason Greenberg. We found the answer was actually women were outperforming men. We thought it might be because there's more women in crowdfunding, right? So there's fashion crowdfunding. We thought maybe you were getting more money because there were more women creating companies and more women backing companies. Maybe that's was the reason. Turns out women were outperforming men where they were the least women. In things like video games and technology products, women were doing the best. And we found that the reason why was that there's a small percentage of women, about a third of women, who actively try and support other women when they see them being disadvantaged. And that was the reason why women were so successful. So it turns out that women helping each other, and 2/3 of women, by the way, wouldn't help other women. They actually were negative towards other women.
I was going to ask you that next.
The 1/3 of women that helped each other out was the reason why women were succeding. So there's something about actively supporting each other that seems to be really important. That was a surprise finding, I think, from some of the work that we're doing.
That is very interesting to me. So you did find, though, because that was literally my next question about women, was you're saying that in your data, the majority of women actually they actually not only do they not help other women, they probably do the opposite. They probably derail them in some way. But the ones who actually do help, those are the ones who become exponentially more successful when they actually do help each other.
That's the way the community advances. So what we did as a side experiment was we took the exact same fake Kickstarter project, right? Mm-hmm. And we showed two versions of it. So we did surveys of hundreds of people, experiments on hundreds of people, and they saw one of two versions of the product. They either saw a version created by a man or a woman. All we changed was the picture. And by the way, we actually used a lab at Princeton to confirm that the pictures were exactly equally attractive, so an equally attractive man and woman. And all we did was change their name from Jessica Smith to Michael Smith, right? So one was Jessica Smith, one was Michael Smith. The most common name for millennials, by the way, in the U.S. is Jessica Smith and Michael Smith.
Really?
So we tried to keep everything the same. Otherwise, nothing changed. So men didn't show a bias either way. They didn't see like whether they put about the same amount of money in whether it's a male or female run project. 2/3 of women said the project created by the man was better. Those people also were people who tended to answer questions that it wasn't important to help out other women, that they didn't see women at a disadvantage. They thought the project, if they saw the male created version of the project, they thought it was better, a higher quality, more likely to succeed. 1/3 of women, the ones who tended to also answer questions that it's important to help other women succeed, women, we have to help each other overcome disadvantage. Those thought the projects created by women were better, and they were more likely to give money than any other group to the women. So it was that small, and we find the same effect by the way venture capital. On average, female venture capital partners invest less money in women-owned ventures than male venture capital partners.
Wow.
So it's about not just representing your group, but also thinking about how you help each other out.
No, I tend to, I feel that anyway. Like I feel it's very true. I've experienced that, right? I think that there's been now more efforts to make a shift, but I don't know how genuine it is, right? Because I've noticed that too. I feel that women tend to, even though it may not be PC to say it, I feel that a lot of women feel very competitive with other women, and therefore would not be a support system.
Yep. The sociology actually backs you up on this. So for most people, there is no matter what your minority status is, right? It could be gender, it could be race, or it could just be that you're from a different country in another group. But if you're a minority group member, there's incentives for you to preserve your minority group member. So women help for example, female bosses promote other women until the level below them has a representative number of women, and then they stop doing it, both because they see less disadvantage then, but also because they don't necessarily want to threaten their own position. So we call this a tokenism effect, and it's a very real thing that you're talking about.
It's called what? Tokenism?
Tokenism.
I love all these. I love all these like terminologies. I mean, I'm trying to think of what else I wanted to I've got so many different questions I want to ask you. Is there anything else that I've missed that you want to talk about that is really important in, talking about what really holds back startups, how to help a startup? Is there anything that I'm missing?
One last thing I wanted to say, which is because we didn't talk about the later stages of a startup, and I think the number one answer is don't be a jerk, right? I think people tend to view entrepreneurs because they're always shown as jerks, right? Like entrepreneurs are always Steve Jobs was a complete jerk a lot of the time, right? Mark Zuckerberg, these are not people who are like, oh, I want to hang out with these people. And that becomes an impression that you need to be some sort of
jerk.
Objectivist, kind of caring about yourself kind of approach. And that just isn't true, right? It turns out that companies where people are supportive and care about each other outperform companies where that doesn't happen. And companies can't have it all. So culture that is good in caring can also be good in innovation and can also be good at execution. So this idea that there's some sort of jerky center of capitalism is not actually supported by the evidence, right? Kindness matters.
Kindness matters. You just said it, corporate culture. I wanted to ask you about corporate culture because with corporate culture comes an employee satisfaction, right? Which then helps, employees, a happier environment would create a happier product, blah, blah, blah. Is there any data that talks about about corporate culture? And let's talk about that.
Yeah, there's pretty overwhelming work on corporate culture, and as you'd expect, corporate cultures that are pro-social, where people help each other, have all sorts of advantages. Places where people feel belonging have all sorts of advantages, and even very directly in startups, we know that organizations that are built around a sense of commitment to each other are more likely to IPO, gain more money, and are more likely to survive survive bad times than those that are built around just cash or work or greed.
Right. What's the exact course that you teach at Wharton, by the way?
So I teach a few of them. Yeah, it's an introduction to entrepreneurship, and then I have some very strange courses where we haven't talked about this, but I'm also super into using games for teaching. So it'll be available to the public in about 6 months, I think. But we actually have games that will teach people how to be an entrepreneur. So I'm working on some of those things too, and I'll happy to come back and talk more about those. Yeah, exactly.
I would love that. Well, another question. Now I'm remembering a couple other questions that I had for you. One was, and then we could definitely come back and talk about that. That would be very interesting. Is an entrepreneur, like we were talking when we first started this podcast about personality traits that make people that you were saying that there's no real, the data shows that it's not actually clear what makes someone a good entrepreneur, but what character traits make them even try or attempt to be an entrepreneur. But my question to you was, now I forgot what the question was. Oh yeah. How, is there ways that you can actually learn? I mean, people think you're either made that way, you're born that way or not. What are some things that you teach people how to actually be a better how to actually go into it and be a better entrepreneur? What do people do if they don't have the money to be at Wharton or the grades?
Yeah. So first of all, the book is a distillation of the course, so that's a place to start. But
I know.
You're the marketing person. See, I'm the academic. There we go. Looks good when you do it.
Thank
you. I would say that there's a couple areas we know. First of all, entrepreneurs are not bored, right? I mean, again, attempts can be bored, right? So we do know there's even some slight evidence that there might be a genetic component about risk taking that makes people founders. If your parents are founders, you're more likely to try, but it doesn't make you successful, right? Okay. So one of the things that drives me craziest is this idea that entrepreneurship is, are born, not made, because it's bad in like 3 different ways, right? It's bad because it makes you think I don't have to learn anything. I just do this. Like this is a natural skill, like being, and like, that's just insane. Like even if you're naturally gifted at basketball, you're still going to practice if you want to be elite, right? Right. So it already says I don't have to learn anything, right? You absolutely have to learn something, right? The second thing it does is say, like, if you don't feel like you're a founder, then maybe you shouldn't be one, and that's not true either. And the third thing is, then you look at the people who feel like they're born founders, and they're often the ones who are free of doubt, and they're like, and that's not the model to follow. You don't have to be free of doubt to be a good founder, right? Right. So I think it's a really terrible idea. And we already know, actually, there's really clear evidence that when you teach people to be a founder, like entrepreneurship skills, they become better founders. So just 2 examples from recent research. If you teach people, and the book goes through this in more detail, how to run experiments, right? Entrepreneurship is an experiment. You're testing things out to see whether they work or not. If you do that in a disciplined manner, a nice study out of Italy just found that you're twice as likely, you generate twice as much revenue a year later if your small business taught to do experiments versus taught other things not about experiments. We also know that you can be taught how to pitch better. So these things are learnable skills. I'm not saying you can learn everything, but you can learn enough stuff. And if you're going to spend your time doing this, you should learn.
No, I think that's great. I think that this book really is extremely helpful for people who are, interested or doing a startup or interested in starting a startup, because like you said, you may not, an entrepreneur may not be born, they can be made. And if you learn how to do a proper elevator pitch, learn how to do a regular pitch, know how to, what people are looking for, how to talk to VCs, also when to go for an angel versus crowdfunding, whatever. These are very, very valuable tips in here and practical tips that people can utilize to have a shot at being successful as a startup and as a founder.
Yeah, that's the hope, right? And it's a small book, right? I'm not going to like there's better books. There are books that will walk you through every step of, here's how you incorporate. That's not here, right? But this is our best evidence we have. It's what I teach in my classes, and it's I think things entrepreneurs should know.
I also think that you're underselling the fact that it's a small book. I think people appreciate the fact that it's a small book because you're not like filling it with a lot of like nonsense and jargon that's not helpful. So you get the meat, and then all the other fluff you can find it somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, when I was looking at creating a book, I was thinking about like, okay, they usually you have to repeat these concepts 20 times, and you need to tell a story for each one, and there's some stories in there, right? But like, I didn't want to have like a 20-page like story where I talk about one founder. There's lots of other good books that'll tell you that stuff, right? So this is really just the narrow. Like, I'm trying to make each sentence hit, and that's the goal.
No, I appreciate that. Believe me, because I have to go through a lot of books in this podcast with guests, and how often do I tell you that I have to read a book that's very, very long, 500 pages, and most of it, 485 pages of it is like nonsense. But you have to go through these stories and case studies and this and this and that and the other just to get to like one point, And like I said, people don't want to do that. They want to get to the meat of the matter. And you've done that really well, Ethan. And so thank you for coming on the podcast. Tell people where they can get the book and where they can follow you or find out more of your findings and data.
So the book is actually partially inspired by my own Twitter feed. So I tweet out tons of articles and random stuff. So you're welcome to follow me at eMollick on Twitter. And there's links to the books on my Twitter profile. And then the unicorn-shadow.com. You can buy the book there, but it's also, I have tons of free resources. So like everything I collect that I give links to my students for classes, like, videos and other information and web articles, you can go there and read all that stuff for free. And then buy the book either like from whatever retailer. And if you buy it on Amazon, you like it, you could write a review. That wouldn't be bad. And then, So again, not marketing as well as you are, but I'm trying. Good job. So I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a total delight and a pleasure. I've learned a lot myself, so I appreciate that.
Thank you. And hopefully I can come back and we can do a treadmill thing at some future point.
Oh my God, absolutely. You got it.
Habits and hustle, time to get it rolling. Stay up on the grind, don't stop, keep it going. Habits and hustle, from nothing into something. All out, hosted by Jennifer Cohen. Visionaries, tune in, you can get to know them. Be inspired, this is your moment. Excuses, we ain't having that. The Habits and Hustle podcast, powered by Habit Nest.